to be read. Now, I'd agree with Orwell, absolutely, that he's a more complex and more honest writer than most of his left and liberal critics claim. But I'm also with Orwell when he says, it's no use pretending that Kipling's view of life as a whole can be accepted or even forgiven by any civilized person. At risk of repeating what Tony's already said, it's no use claiming, for instance, that when Kipling describes a British soldier beating a nigger with a cleaning rod in order to get money out of him, he is acting merely as a reporter and does not necessarily approve what he describes. There is not the slightest sign anywhere in Kipling's work that he disapproves of that kind of conduct. On the contrary, there is a definite strain of sadism in him, over and above the brutality which a writer of that type has to have. Kipling is a jingo imperialist. He's morally insensitive and aesthetically disgusting. It is better to start by admitting that and then to try to find out why it is that he survives when the refined people who have sniggered at him seem to wear so badly. I'm afraid you can't read Kipling except in the context of his time. Orwell again. Kipling belongs very definitely to the period 1885 to 1902. The Great War and its aftermath embittered him, but he shows little sign of having learned anything from any event later than the Boer War. It's a brutal summation, but one I think is accurate.
There we are, there's our protagonists and there's the arguments. We're now going to have some questions. You can either just make a point, briefly, please, or you can ask one of our panelists to say something else. We'll have a period of that kind of discussion. I'll take several people together. Because I've got these lights shining in my eyes, I can't see as well as I should, but I'll do my best. And then at the end, I'm going to ask our panelists just to give their final pitch.
Thank you very much, panel, for superb speeches. I speak as one who love and admire both Kipling and Orwell in different ways. However, both sides, I fear, glossed over a couple of skeletons in their respective cupboards. I would like to ask you to give you the opportunity of coming clean on these. First one, in the case of Kipling, you mentioned several, sir, but there's one more that I should add to the list. And that is that Lord Birkenhead was commissioned to write a biography of Kipling, if memory serves me right, which the Kipling family suppressed, would not allow him to publish. Sorry?
He just said that.
Yes. And I would like to know what they had against the biography, which caused them to suppress it. The other one, of course, is the question about Orwell's possible involvement as a spy, or MI5. So I wonder if you could like to comment on both those.
Okay, let's do that first. Let's get the skeletons out of the way. What about the Kipling skeleton?
Well, frankly, I'm baffled by this. I mean, Birkenhead wrote a biography of Kipling, and as far as I know, he published it.
No, not quite. He was a very, very bad and lazy biography. And Mrs. Kipling, quite rightly, didn't want it published.
We seem to have two different defences. Okay, we haven't got time. I don't know whether we've got an answer to the Orwell skeleton, so-called.
Orwell's list. Indeed, we were talking about this last night.
Yeah.
Hang on, could we just get on to that one?
Sorry.
The famous list that Orwell put together, it was a bit of a parlour game that he played, which was to do with sorting out who among the myriad contributors to left-wing newspapers were following the Moscow line, or secret communists, or reliable, useful idiots for the Stalin regime. They put this together in a notebook, and the point of it was not to do anything more with it than, well, to keep a note for his own purposes when he was writing himself. At a point when he was, very, very ill towards the end of his life, a very good friend, C.A. Kerwin, who started work for the Research Department, which was a Foreign Office, it was a public relations department, basically, at that point, essentially came to Orwell saying, we've got to commission a large amount of work, have you got any advice? And he said, well, if you want people who are going to write pro-democratic, socialist pamphlets, which is essentially what IRD was about at the time, don't use this lot. They're people who will basically run the Moscow line. And that was the beginning and the end of the famous list. It was not a blacklist, it was a list of people who, well, frankly, if I were you, I wouldn't commission. Now, I don't actually keep a list like that myself on paper, but I've got one like that in the back of my head when it comes down to commissioning people on Iraq or on Iran or on any number of political issues where you know that people are going to be following a particular line. They won't declare it necessarily. That's all it was.
Okay. That's dealt with the skeleton as far as we can. Now back to the flesh and blood.
Firstly, it turns out I've got a lot more reading to do than I thought. Thank you very much. Secondly, I think it was Paul going through Orwell's Britishness, mentioned cynicism, and I hope not, because I think scepticism is a much healthier thing, and that's the one I've always thought of.
Thank you. Another hand? There's one up there on the left-hand side.
Thank you. The point that occurs to me from all that has been said is that these are both writers of their time. I wonder if the panel has got any view on how they would have been had they each lived in the time of the other rather than their own.
I'll give them time to think about that. I think we'll come in a bit later. Any more hands for the moment? Just down here on the right-hand side. Really?
Thank you. As the chair said in introducing the session, it's arguably a bit pointless trying to say one writer is better than another. They're different, and you know, it's a rich thing to understand their difference. But what troubles me is that on both sides, you use the phrase aesthetically disgusting. Now, to me, I find that an extraordinary and almost unacceptable phrase, actually, because I understand aesthetic. I understand aesthetically disgusting.
Yeah,
there's a quote from Orwell on Kipling.
Well, okay, but people on both sides use the term without any reflective comment on it.
No, it's a quote from Orwell on...
But I don't care, well, honestly, I don't care who it's a quote from. I think it's a problematic term in a discussion about literary texts and their producers.
Yeah, well that makes it, I think, an attack on Orwell rather than an attack on anybody who's used the quotation here. But thank you. Thank you for that. Anybody else from the panel?
Can I contest that? We have Orwell saying that when Kipling describes a soldier beating a nigger with a dose of cleaving rod, that he's only reporting what he describes and doesn't approve it. It seems to me that both of you used that phrase aesthetically disgusting, and you didn't qualify it. So sort of rather like you weren't just reporting, you were kind of endorsing. So I think that's fair enough. And I have to say
I disagree with that. I think if the sentence is quite clear about what Orwell thinks about Kipling,
sure.
Being able to say this is what Orwell thought of Kipling is perfectly acceptable without having to go around.
Of course it is.
I don't see there's any issue with what anybody has actually said.
Well,
in regards to that sentence. Bearing in mind that it's just what Orwell thought about Kipling, and as this debate is about Orwell versus Kipling, then
it's more than that. It's a smear because he does exactly what Edward Said does in Orientalism, which is he actually misquotes and misinterprets and omits. It's what I call the gullible smear. Let me give you this, because exactly this phrase is disgusting. He damns Kipling with faint praise. Look at one example, which is this, all right? Is that Hitlerite trick of repeating the same word again and again and again without actually any sort of qualification. Here, quote. I quote, the vulgarity of his prose style, his vulgar tricks of style, his bouncing vulgar vitality, his cruelty by vulgarity a vulgar flag waver, words perceived by generation to generation to be vulgar, vulgar thoughts vigorously expressed. I could go on. This actually goes on and on and on. Horrible vulgar. And then, let's say, he says, Life That Failed, Kipling's solitary novel. Ever heard Kim? You know, Kim is one of the greatest works, I think, of the 19th century. It's a deeply spiritual quest.
Before we...
I'm just going to raise that. I mean, that's that.
Before we start using the language of smears, before we start using the language of smears, though, let's just be clear. Let's just be clear. I mean, Orwell's frame was that Kipling was morally insensitive and aesthetically disgusting. Now, I'm not sure whether morally insensitive is all right, but even if aesthetically disgusting isn't, it's Orwell that is being quoted. So if you find it offensive, the attack is on Orwell. It's not on people who recite Orwell's verdict on Kipling. That's the point. So let's not get bogged down. Any more? Yes, left at the back.
Thank you. Kipling and Orwell, it seems to me, lived and wrote at a time when the cultural life of England was suffused with, well, what one might call racist ideas of one sort. And I think one of your members of the panel referred to anti-Semitism. What I would like to hear on both sides, or from both sides, is any evidence that Kipling or Orwell deconstructed and criticised the racist positions that seem to be almost embedded in English intellectual life at the time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I'll just hold it for a moment and we'll take one or two more. I'll ask them to come back. Over on the right-hand side. Do we have a hand over on the right? No? Okay, let's come back.
I'm a great admirer of Kipling and have been read the books as a boy. I find one thing disturbing about him. I don't like so many revenge stories. There are a lot of these, and I think you can have too much of a good thing.
That's not the same as aesthetically disgusting, though, is it? Do we have?
I wonder if I could put another dimension on Kipling. He belongs in that list of writers like Shakespeare, Wordsworth, Tennyson, who've given marvellous phrases, almost a history of the English language. And I think a lot of Kipling's phrases, although they may be in extraordinarily unrespectable or very respectable contexts, I feel as though the morning's missed out on a man who just had the ear and the ability to write phrases in poetry which everybody not only knows but loves and cherishes and is in that great tradition, if I can use a legal side phrase, but in a great tradition of wonderful, wonderful poetic lines. Whether they are in a good poem or not, there's just something about the phrases of Kipling which I would like us just to mention.
Thanks for that. Yeah, we'll do racism, we'll do revenge, and we'll do the ear.
Can I take the ear? Can I take the ear? I agree with what you're saying. There is, however, a real danger that we might actually lose this in terms of Kipling not being taught, not being read. Because you said, someone said, as a boy, or I read these as a child, and I read the Just So stories, and I read the Jungle Book. When I was growing up, one interaction with the Jungle Book was when you started Scouts. You got a copy of the Jungle Book. Fewer people going to Scouts, and Scouts having, you know, the same kind of reputation as Kipling already has. You have fewer people reading it. So then, the next point is that, of course, well, he's not really taught in schools or secondary schools. That was already happening in the 70s. Certainly, Kipling wasn't taught when I was at school. So then, what are you left with? You're left with Oobie or Want to Be Like You, and you're left with, if you can keep your head while those around you are not, you don't know what's going on. And that's the scary thing, is that Kipling, if he is not taught and he is not understood in any way, all of those things will be lost. Now, whether that is down to